Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Entrepreneurship Lab. This is your host, Nevin Bajalac, welcoming you once again to the podcast where we help you grow and scale your business. Today, we have a special guest coming to us all the way from United States, and his name is Blair LaCorte, and he is an extensive entrepreneur with huge experience in different industries. He's going to share his journey with us. And today we're going to talk about what are investors looking for in a business. Blair, welcome to the show and thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit more. You've been in aviation, you were an investor, you're in so many industries that was hard for me to pick one thing to introduce you. But tell us a little bit more about your journey so listeners can get to know you.
Sure. I think sometimes when you look at someone's resume or their LinkedIn, it's a linear story, and you try to look at how they got from point A to point B. But I'm sure, as most people on the podcast know, it's a lot less linear. And that, as my dad would say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. And what he really meant by that is to be lucky, you have to be in the right place at the right time and doing the right thing. And then you have to be smart enough to know you're in the right place. I think a lot of people assume if they work hard, they're going to be in the right place. And that, it takes both, right? And the real key to being an entrepreneur is knowing, are you at that moment where you can step on the gas? The biggest failures of entrepreneurs are being too early or being too late, right? It's all about understanding the macro and the marketplace. Now, there is an X factor, and the X factor is your will, and your adaptability, and your support network, so that you don't have a nervous breakdown. But I would say that that's the special sauce. But if you screw up the timing, then it doesn't matter how smart you are or how much willpower you have.
Yeah, I love that. So your journey is definitely not linear. So you come from a family of entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, that's the irony, I think, is I grew up with my parents had uh, divorced, like many people, and my father was a started a consulting firm for hiring people. So I got to grow up talking about who would be good for what job, and going to listen to him talk to people about their careers. And then my mother and my stepfather went off and started basically a startup airline. So when I was growing up, the word entrepreneurship was not exactly a positive influence for me, because as the oldest male, I was always worried about whether we were going to make it, whether we were going to be able to pay the rent or not. So I convinced myself that I did not want to be an entrepreneur, that I really wanted to go to school and learn about business, because this can't be business. What's happening here can't be what real business is. So I went to college and got a degree in business, and then I went to a training program at General Electric, which was one of the biggest companies and the biggest training program in the United States at the time. And then, just to top it off, I said, you know what? I'm going to go back and get my MBA in business. And what I found through my journey is that you can't really learn business from academics. You can learn business skills, and that business is really an apprentice game, that you have to do it, and you have to have people with you that actually help you and teach you. And so when I got out of business school, I decided that I would not do the traditional tact. I would go into consulting, but I would go into consulting in places that were looking to change. And so it wasn't true entrepreneurship, but it was entrepreneurial. So I picked a little group of 20 people, and we would go into divisions of big companies that they didn't like anymore, that they were not their favorite. And we would go and we would be able to be entrepreneurial and turn it around and try new things and take risks. And at that moment, I realized that maybe I was denying what I really like to do, which is, if you're an entrepreneur, there's two things that um, have to go along with a good idea. And if you have these two things, then you're probably going to actually find a way to win over time. And one of them is pattern recognition. Most people think it's all about being an entrepreneur is taking a risk. It is. You have to be strong enough to say, I have an idea, no one else believes in it, no one's seen it, I'm going to take a risk. But if you don't have pattern recognition, and you don't have something in you that says I can be a fact finder, then you go out of business pretty quickly, because the risks are too volatile. So you have to take a risk until you know it's not good. So again, you probably heard the cliche: fail often and fast, and then
Yeah.
win long, right? Which means try, but do not drive off the cliff just because that's where you started, right? If you see you're going off a cliff, then you turn. And the second piece I think is really important, and this will sound a little bit ironic because a lot of tech entrepreneurs are not people, they're tech people, but you have to understand people. That doesn't mean you have to be the best social person out there, but if you don't understand who the right person is at the right time in the right place. I started, one of my first things when I got out of consulting was, it's kind of ironic, again, back to nonlinear. One of the guys that I had worked for, the head of strategy at General Electric, who was a great person and a good mentor to me, called me up and said, look, you're doing all these consulting jobs, you're having fun, but why don't you come to a real business for a year just so you can remember what that's like? And he said, come work for Sun. Now, I was reorganizing Mobil oil in upstream in Canada. So it was a big job. I thought he must have read about me and said, oh my God, this guy I mentored is really good in oil and gas. So I just hung up the phone and said, okay, I'll take the job. You don't even have to tell me anymore. I want to work for you. Again, there's one of those things. You work for people and you work for people who will teach you. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, when I got the letter in the mail, it wasn't Sun Oil. It was Sun Microsystems. And I was actually in the largest and fastest growing hardware company, and I was head of worldwide strategy for 33,000 people. My point being, the guy who sat next to me, the head of R&D, was a guy named Eric Schmidt, who went on to take over Google. The first thing he told me is he said, look, you don't know tech, but the biggest problems in entrepreneurship and technology are getting people to get things done. And so that's where I go back to people and say, look, if you're good at pattern recognition in people, you'll probably figure out a way to make your vision happen. Which, again, it would be great to have a great idea, and it's awesome to be really good at technology. But those two things, you need both sides of the scale.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. So now talking about ideas and different businesses, I know you're an investor and you know so many investors, you have huge experience. So a lot of our listeners are startups and maybe they want to attract an investor in their business or they never thought about it, but it's good to actually invest in other businesses. And can you talk to us a little bit more about that? Like what are investors looking for or what are you looking for when you want to invest in a business?
Sure. And they're two sides, of the same coin. But let me start with what I would, and I have told my sons, right? Because all of them have started businesses. So the first thing that you need to think of is that you already have an investor, and that's you. So the biggest investment you'll ever make is what you spend your time on. So you already actually know that you have an investor. And one of the things you have to do, and the most important thing, is to be self-aware, right? And there's a sequence that almost every human goes through if you look at behavioral science, which is when you become very self-aware about what you're doing and where you're spending your time, you'll become delusioned because you'll realize I could be doing more, or I'm struggling with certain things. And then the most important thing is taking a step forward. So the first thing I would say is that you need to make sure that you're investing in the right thing. The second thing is when you look at an external investor, someone not yourself, right? The first thing people think of is friends and family, people who know them. They're one degree of separation or ex-workers. And you have to be very, very careful with those because the easiest way to lose friends and family is actually to have them invest in you. Because the problem is if you fail, whether you like it or not, they're not going to be happy. And if you win, they're going to lose as well. Why do I say that? Because if you're going to win and you're going to keep raising money, they're not going to be able to put more money in and they're going to keep getting diluted and diluted and diluted. So you can continue to get stock because you're in the company. They can't. And when you start to get preferred investors, they won't be able to qualify to be a preferred investor. So be very careful when you look at your first group of investors. If you're looking at friends and family, they need to understand what they're getting into. And you have to think about the fact that, and most people don't think about this, I will build in a structure that when I get a professional investor, he will guarantee that he will buy out the first investors at a formula. And by the way, they'll all do it because if they really want to invest in you, they're happy to take more stock. But if you don't put that expectation in your documentation, early on in your mindset, they'll just let those people sit and they'll just keep diluting them out. So first thing I would say about investors is who your investor is. If it's friends and family, then have a plan for them to get in and for them to get out. And if they don't want to get out and they want to take the ride, sometimes it works out. But very often, unless you're going to go from $10 valuation to $10 billion valuation, that small amount of stock they have will continue to get pushed and pushed and pushed. The second thing I would say about, or third, thing I'd say about investors is that when you look at an investor, understand that you automatically start a time clock. Okay, so it's not that you win when you get an investor. You are actually starting a clock that says if they don't get their money back in 5 years, you will become misaligned and there will be big tension. And the tension can be on one end, they'll take control of your company. And the tension on the other end is they will make your life a living hell so that your company goes out of business. So getting an investor is actually a big decision about how close you are to making an investor happy. Because as long as your valuation is going up, and as long as they can see a way to get their money back, you're best friends. You're happy. They're going to help you. They're going to talk about you. They're going to try to get customers for you. But the second that you become misaligned, which means you're struggling along, but you're making progress, at that point in time, you're called a middling investment, which means I got to spend my time on investments that are doing well. And I don't like middling investments. So when you look at the statistics that a VC may lose 8 of its investments, that isn't because a lot of those investments couldn't make it. It's because when you look at data theory, it doesn't make sense. They drive them almost out of business or sell them because they have to focus on the ones that can get 10, 20, 30 times return. So again, you asked me a question about how to get an investor. First step is understand who an investor is. Now, if you talk about, you're at the right timing, you think all you need to do, when you take a seed investor, for instance, a seed investor is to help you get the product prototype done. When you take a friends and family investment or an early stage investment, it's to finish the product. When you go to an institution, a VC, then you actually need to know that what your product is done, it's the Series A, but what you really need money for is to scale and to figure out how to sell it. If you misalign that and take that Series A investor too soon, they will be very frustrated in you because you're going to have to raise another round. So think about it that the investor only thinks about 2 things. I know you think they think about your company, and they do. But one of the things that I did, I've had 2 VC companies, I've been in a private equity company, and I've also funded over 100 companies. I can tell you that this is the truth. When an investor looks at an investment, the first rule to being a good investor is either unique advantage or I have to look at a lot of deals, which means I have to actually talk to you for 45 minutes and kill you very quickly because the more time I spend, the better. So if I look at 100 deals, I get a good investment. If I look at 1,000 deals, I get a better investment. So the first thing to realize is you only have 45 minutes to make an impression that's going to say to them, I want to spend more time with you. So you're not going for an investment the first time you meet an investor. You're going to actually get an investment of more of their time. Okay. The second thing an investor looks at is what's the bet and what's my risk? That's it. So if you can't articulate, I don't care that this thing is cool. What's my bet? My bet is if I do this cool thing, these 3 things will happen and you will make a lot of money. If you can't explain what's the bet, they can't then figure out what the risk is, right? So what's my bet and what's my risk in 45 minutes? So that's what an investor is actually thinking at the beginning. And finally, what I would say about investors, again, I alluded to it earlier. If you're aligned with an investor, that's great. That's the best thing you can have. You're doing well together and they will be there. But if you're misaligned, it's because the investor doesn't work for you. He works for who he raises money from. Now, if he's investing his own money, it's even worse because he raised his money from his wife and his family. And so he's really going to be pissed. So think about the fact that they're going to be on a timeline. They want to get their money back. They have to know what the bet is. They have to know what the risk is. They have to know, can they raise the next round? Because very rarely are you going to raise money and you're not going to raise the next round. So what I would tell you is that the most important thing about getting an investor is realizing who they are. It's not saying you got a cool company. So a final piece from an investor standpoint is, when you go to investor, you have to understand their business. If you have to know who they are, how big is their fund? What do they invest in? Did they just raise their fund, or at the end of their fund? You have to ask them, do you usually invest in multiple rounds? Which means that when they make the investment, they reserve a little more money. There's not a good or bad in this, but if you don't understand that, it's like going out and dating and realizing you're about to get married to someone who doesn't like to go on vacation, or you're about to marry to someone who wants to eat in every night, right? It's a different than if you like to eat out or you like to go on vacation. So be very careful. We all want to please, and we all want to have someone tell us we're good enough that we'll get an investment. But really picking the right one is important. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is thinking that he likes me or she likes me, and they're willing to give me a big valuation. Valuation is irrelevant. Valuation is irrelevant because what an investor will do, if they're smart, is if you say, I want to be worth $5 million, I can make you worth $5 million. I'm going to take this much of your company. I'm going to put a preferred thing in here that says it's structured so that if we sell the company because it doesn't work, I'll get 2 times my money before you get anything. I'll say that I can get a pick in there so that if you're not doing a certain thing, I'll get more stock. So structure is as important as valuation. So any entrepreneur who goes to investors says, oh my God, one, you have to look at how it's structured, because the way that they make it less and they take out their risk is they structure all of these terms in there. So just again, think about who you're getting money from and is it the right time? And then how do they think about it, right? What's my bet and what's my risk? And then third is what my valuation, what my structure is, and can I raise the next round is the same. You have to ask that question right there. I always would ask someone, hey, if this goes well, are you going to help me with the next round? And can you give me some examples of where you've done that? A lot of people will say, yeah, I'm going to help you, but they don't know anyone. So the worst is to get stuck with an investor where you're at the next level and they don't know anyone and you don't know anyone. Because if you're succeeding, it's important to keep feeding the fire.
Very interesting. So much information to absorb. Thank you for that. And I just want to continue. I actually watched some of your interviews and actually shows. You've been in different shows where, different startups are looking for investors and are investing a lot. So what is something, I mean, there's some investors that come and pitch some businesses and they did great in sales. And there's some that didn't do any sales, but still they got an investor. What is something that makes you want to invest? Like, do you like the structure? Do you like to see the predictions, or I don't know, marketing
Right.
ideas?
Well, look,
What is something
well, I shouldn't say every investor, but what I say is the first thing you have to understand is, what is the human problem? What is the human problem, right? Because when you look at an investment, you're doing 2 things. The first is behavioral science. You're trying to figure out why this is valuable to someone, right? At the end of the day, it's got to be valuable. So you got to understand what's the problem and is this really a solution? The second is math. It's just math. How big is the market? How much could I charge in margins on something? So the first thing I always try to do is figure out what the problem is, and then I try to figure out how large or profitable can this market be, right? So if I'm looking at a service business, it's very different than I'm looking at a product business, and it's very different than I'm looking at a platform business. They all have their own patterns. The second thing I look at is the entrepreneur. So I was on the board of a thing called the Kairos Foundation for many years, and I was the working class person of the board. It was ex-President Clinton, Elon Musk, the Rockefeller family from the U.S., a lot of very powerful and well-connected people who had a passion for entrepreneurship. And what we did is we went around the world to colleges around the world. We had them put in submissions, and we picked 50 students from around the world that had started businesses in college or business school. And so one of the things that we found out over that 10 years was that even if a person didn't win with their first business, the fact that they started a business early and that they were willing to keep trying, they eventually ended up with it. One of my mentees just got a $3.9 billion valuation, right? Another of my mentees actually had a $2.5 billion valuation. Now, their first businesses didn't work. So the first thing I look for is what's the problem? What's the size of the market? The second thing I look for is the psychology of the entrepreneur, right? And what did we say earlier? What's the psychology? They're creative. They like to take risks, but they're a fact finder, and they're going to look at patterns, and they're not going to have their ego get in the way. They're curious. They want to learn. They're willing to adapt. They're willing to live with ambiguity, and they're willing to sacrifice for this business. So the second thing is always the entrepreneur. I've seen some great ideas. I've passed because there's not a great entrepreneur. I've seen some kind of middle of the road entrepreneur ideas, but the entrepreneur was so great. I knew that if I talked with them, we'd figure out something to do. So those are the two first things that you look at. Now, again, what I would say is that be careful, because I just gave you a general investor thing. There are a lot of investors, and I actually appreciate and respect this, that believe that their money is not enough, and so that they have either connections or expertise in an industry. And so that would be a third thing. Can they actually help you? That's what a really smart investor will say, because it's like saying, hey, I'm great at playing cards and I can count those cards, but if I can actually see, cards that other people can't see, then I'm actually going to be able to bet in a better way. So now it doesn't have to be that it's just a technology knowledge or it's a vertical knowledge. If they've done a lot of startups and they understand how to help you and coach you, then that also is an advantage that they can add to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Blair, so much. And I would like, as the time is approaching, to wrap up maybe with some final advice or tips that you want to tell listeners and that maybe we didn't mention on this topic.
Well, I guess that my biggest tip is again probably a very simple one, which is that at the end of the day, one of my best friends was a palliative care doctor, and in the U.S. that means they sit with people when they die. They try to ease them into death, and he watched 1,000 people die, and then he came to me at the end of it and he said, "Look, this is what I've learned. Okay, that when people are at the end of their life, they only ask 3 or 4 things: who loves me? Who did I love? Did I make a difference? When I was here, and was I my authentic self?" Because all of us actually try to fit into things, right? And so we don't sometimes, do what we wanted to do because we want to fit into our family or our community or our business sector, and we always say we have to make money to do this. So my advice is that business is just a sport. It's a sport. 99% of the people who are on this earth go to work every day and have no choice because they need to do what they need to do to survive. If you're lucky enough that you mentally can take the risk, because maybe financially it hurts, or that financially you can take the risk to try to start up your own business, then you're already a winner. So think about it from the perspective of you will fail. It isn't the fact that you will not be wrong. I will guarantee you, I've seen very few people, I don't know if I can think of one, that actually their first idea was right. Now, they may be directionally right, but you're going to fail. So what's the greatest attribute of an athlete that's playing a sport is the ability to recover quickly and to learn. What's the biggest attribute of someone having, been in theater and in the military before? It's the ability for you to actually leave, strip the emotion of whatever happened and understand the facts. So what I would say to you is it's resilience. It's resilience. It's learning that when you make mistakes, to forgive yourself, to forgive others, and to get up. So when you jump rope, they time how long it takes for your heart rate to get back to your normal heart rate. That's resilience. Your body is strong. So what I would challenge you to do is watch how long it takes you after a disappointment or a failure to recover and get back on track. Because if you can the faster you can do that, the more you're going to learn. And again, I'd leave you with um, cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable because it's hard, you're learning. But being curious is the best way to be happy, right? Follow your heart, be curious, and be resilient.
I love that. I love that. And we should cheer to all of you who are entrepreneurs and doing it out there because, yeah, like Blair said, you already succeeded. You took the risk. You have the mental strength to do what most people cannot do. Thank you, Blair, so much for being here. Really, this was so insightful and it was a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me. And you can find all my stuff on my LinkedIn. If there's something that's useful to you, or that if you write me a note and I can do something and give you a tip. It's tough to spend a ton of time, but if there's something out there I can do that's very easy to do, I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. Make sure to download the episode, subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Give us some like, comments, hearts, and share it with at least one person that can benefit from this episode. Thank you for listening, and I see you in the next one.